Engines roar like wild animals in cages. Old racing videos shake as if the film itself remembers how dangerous it was. In the middle of all this loud history stands one man. He's thin, has sharp eyes, a cigarette hanging from his mouth, and a grin like someone who already knows he's smarter than everyone else around him. His name is Smokey Yunick, a mechanic who never cared about rules, what people thought of him, or playing it safe and fair. He cared about winning and proving he could outsmart anyone in Detroit, no matter how many millions of dollars they spent trying to stop him. He didn't grow up in fancy company test rooms or shiny labs. He learned by breaking things apart and then making them stronger. A World War II fighter pilot turned crazy scientist mechanic. Smokey came home believing that limits were just made up and engineers were too scared to admit it. If racing was a war, he planned to fight like a man who'd seen real battle. Everyone in NASCAR and American racing knew the same thing. When Smokey Yunick entered a race, the rule book became just a suggestion. He found the unclear spots between every rule. He questioned every measurement. He built engines so strange, so smart, so far beyond normal thinking that inspectors often just stood there silent, trying to understand what they were even looking at. But in 1969, Smokey took on a challenge more dangerous than any racetrack, beating Chevrolet at their own game. By then, Chevy's small block engine program was unbeatable. Their Camaro Z28 was winning Trans Am races like an unstoppable machine. Ford had tried everything. Nothing worked. They needed more than just horsepower. They needed a wild card player. So they called the man Detroit feared most. Smokey listened, let the offer hang in the air, and finally said the same thing he'd say years later when asked why he took the job. Because nobody else could. Behind closed doors, Ford whispered their goal. Build a 302 cubic inch engine, so powerful it would scare Chevrolet. Smokey flicked ash from his cigarette. He grinned and said the line that would become legendary. Sure, but don't blame me if it scares you too. Before Smokey Yunick ever touched a Ford engine, Chevrolet stood on top of the American racing world like a king who thought the crown was glued to his head. The mid-1960s were Chevy's time, an age of small block engine dominance, championship banners, and rival teams staring at the back of a Camaro Z28 as it roared across finish lines. Chevrolet's engineers weren't just confident, they were cocky. Their 302 small block was a masterpiece, a screaming, high-revving monster that made other car makers feel like they showed up with farm tractors. The Camaro wasn't just fast. Its winning became mind games. Ford drivers mumbled about Chevy power in the garages. Chrysler teams joked that beating the Z28 required help from God. If any company wanted a shot at Trans Am glory, they had to go through Chevrolet's perfectly tuned machine. Deep inside Detroit, Chevy engineers believed Ford couldn't catch up. Their confidence was so high that company memos bragged the Camaro was unmatched by any competitor they could imagine. They built engines with precision and pride, backed by budgets other teams only dreamed of. But their cockiness had a dark side. Whispers passed between team managers. If Ford ever finds someone with the brains to match our budget, things could get ugly. But someone was already out there. Scruffy, unpredictable, and banned from half the NASCAR garages for being too clever for his own good. Chevy thought they were untouchable because they played by the rules they helped write. What they didn't think about was a mechanic who didn't care about rules at all. Smokey Yunick didn't see boundaries. He saw chances. He didn't see specifications. He saw loopholes. And when Ford started losing enough races to feel really embarrassed, they realized they needed more than engineers. They needed a troublemaker, a rebel, someone who could tear down Chevy's golden era with nothing more than a wrench, a cigarette, and refusing to accept defeat. Chevy still didn't know it, but their reign was about to meet its match. Ford's bosses were desperate, but they weren't dumb. When decades of engineering couldn't stop Chevrolet's winning streak, they realized they needed someone unconventional, someone who didn't belong in a company meeting room. Someone who didn't listen to committees, guidelines, or technical directors. Someone who scared the rule makers. So they called the only man in America who could scare Chevrolet without even picking up a wrench. Smokey Yunick. His shop, the best damn garage in town, wasn't a place of order. It was a laboratory of chaos. parts scattered in piles, exotic metals lying next to broken carburetors, engines that looked like they'd been built during a lightning storm. Smokey didn't invent horsepower. He summoned it. When Ford representatives walked into his garage, they weren't greeted with a handshake. They walked into an atmosphere buzzing with electricity and danger. Smokey listened to Ford's offer with a smirk. Build a 302 that could knock Chevy off their throne. Build something Ford engineers couldn't even imagine. Build a weapon. But Smokey had conditions. He demanded total freedom. No oversight, no committees, no company second-guessing. He told Ford he'd break a few commandments, and they nodded, not quite realizing he meant it for real. He didn't want permission. He wanted immunity. Ford agreed because they weren't hiring a mechanic. They were hiring a man who changed the physics of racing every time he touched an engine. What Smokey didn't say out loud, but knew instantly, was that beating Chevy wasn't just about horsepower. It was about embarrassing a rival who had looked down on him. GM had cut ties with him after years of friction, and Smokey carried that insult like a scar on his pride. Ford's offer wasn't just a job. It was payback wrapped in opportunity. So he rolled up his sleeves, lit another cigarette, and said the line that would echo for years in Ford's racing history. You want a 302 that'll spank Chevy? Fine. But you better be ready for what you asked for. And with that, Smokey Yunick got to work. Before Smokey Yunick touched the Ford 302, it was a respectable engine. Solid, reliable, nothing extraordinary. But Smokey didn't care about respectable. He cared about dominance. He viewed the 302 engine block the way a sculptor views a block of stone, full of potential nobody else saw. Where Ford engineers saw limitations, Smokey saw a foundation begging to be changed. He studied the block like a surgeon planning an operation. The head flow was weak. The rod angles were inefficient. The crank flexed under high RPM. Any other engineer would have accepted these as unavoidable realities of small block design. Smokey didn't accept reality. He rebuilt it. He milled high-swirl combustion chambers that forced air to tumble violently, creating burn efficiency Ford never imagined. He offset bored pistons to increase dwell time at top dead center. He reshaped the intake manifolds until they looked alien, breathing more like a 351 Cleveland than a 302 Windsor. Every part he touched became something Ford engineers couldn't recognize anymore. Then came his favorite trick, making air behave like fuel and fuel behave like air. Smokey understood that an engine wasn't a machine. It was a living organism. Feed it right and it rewards you with violence. Feed it perfectly and it becomes unstoppable. By the time he finished, the Boss 302 wasn't just an engine. It was rebellion cast in iron and steel. It revved higher than physics suggested, made power beyond anything Ford engineers thought possible, and left anyone who tried to copy it shaking their head. Smokey didn't just improve the 302. He reinvented what a small block Ford could be. Smokey Yunick didn't just build engines. He weaponized loopholes. His entire way of thinking revolved around one truth. If the rulebook didn't specifically forbid it, then it was legal. And if it did forbid it, he'd find a way to make inspectors think otherwise. Ford knew this. Chevy feared it. Smokey embraced it. His first stroke of brilliance was the hot vapor fuel system, a Frankenstein solution critics said shouldn't work until it did. He heated fuel until it reached near vapor state, making each droplet explode with maximum burn efficiency. Most mechanics thought gasoline needed to be cool. Smokey showed them that heat, used correctly, could turn a motor into a controlled explosion chamber. Then came the headers. Smokey understood exhaust flow better than anyone alive. He welded secret expansion chambers inside the pipes, allowing exhaust gases to speed up like a bullet leaving a gun barrel. Inspectors looked for oversized headers. Smokey hid his magic inside. Nothing oversized, nothing illegal, yet nothing anyone had ever seen before. The fuel line trick was his favorite. When NASCAR limited fuel tank size, Smokey simply oversized the fuel line, giving himself an extra half-gallon of fuel that officials never measured. When they forced him to remove the fuel tank, claiming his car was illegal, Smokey famously drove the car away without a fuel tank installed. His response: make better rules. Word traveled fast. Other teams complained. Inspectors stalked his garage. Chevy engineers begged NASCAR to step in. But every time they tried to catch him, Smokey just smiled, lit another cigarette, and offered them a chair, knowing they'd never find the real trick. He wasn't cheating. He was outsmarting everyone who thought they understood engines. Smokey didn't innovate for glory. He innovated because he hated wasted potential. The world played checkers. Smokey Yunick played three-dimensional chess with a blowtorch. His methods weren't just clever, they were revolutionary. And every trick had one purpose: to make Ford's Boss 302 into a small block Chevy could never match. By the time Smokey Yunick unveiled his first fire-breathing Boss 302, the racing world felt a shake. Chevy teams leaned over pit wall fences, listening to test runs like soldiers hearing enemy artillery for the first time. Something had changed. Something dangerous was stirring from inside Smokey's garage. The 1969 Trans Am season became a battlefield. On one side stood the Camaro Z28, reliable, refined, and proven. On the other, the Ford Boss 302, unpredictable, violent, and engineered by a man who treated rulebooks like scrap paper. Bud Moore ran Ford's factory team, while Roger Penske commanded Chevy's navy blue Camaro Warriors. It wasn't just Ford versus Chevy anymore. It was Smokey Yunick versus anyone who thought they could out-engineer him. Whispers spread through the paddock. Rumors that Smokey's engines were making over 470 horsepower, a number Trans Am engineers laughed at until they heard the boss scream past pit lane at 8,000 revolutions per minute. Chevy mechanics accused him of illegal modifications. Smokey countered with sarcastic invitations to go find them. Then the first race results came in. Ford's Boss engines weren't just competitive. They were terrifying. Chevy drivers reported the Fords pulling harder out of corners, revving longer, and showing none of the fatigue Chevy engines experienced after long lap punishment. Something was different. Something big. Chevy's engineering department scrambled. Panic meetings were held. Secret memos circulated calling Smokey's engine suspect and demanding inspections. But every time the sanctioning body tore down one of his motors, they found nothing illegal. Just design features so clever that no one else had the creativity to imagine them. The rivalry wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Chevy's confidence cracked when they realized Ford's new secret weapon wore a cowboy hat and smiled every time they accused him of cheating. The 1969 season wasn't just a competition. It was a war of innovation and ego. And for the first time, Chevy wasn't sure they would win. Late one night, with the doors locked and the world asleep, Smokey Yunick wheeled the Boss 302 prototype onto his dyno. Ford executives stood quietly behind him, nervous, hopeful, and completely unaware of what they were about to witness. Smokey didn't look nervous. He looked like a man preparing to unleash something that shouldn't exist. The engine barked to life. Not a roar, not a scream, something deeper. A low, angry growl that vibrated the concrete floor. Smokey listened, cigarette hanging from his lips, hands resting casually on the control panel. At 4,000 revolutions per minute, the Boss sounded strong. At 6,000, it sounded mean. At 7,000, it sounded unholy. But Smokey wasn't done. He nudged the throttle higher. The needle crept past 7,500. Most small blocks would have scattered parts across the room by now, but Smokey's creation kept climbing. The Ford executives exchanged looks, disbelief mixed with fear. Then, the engine hit 8,000 revolutions per minute and held. The dyno readout flashed numbers that made one man's knees buckle. A small block legal displacement, Ford architecture, pushing horsepower figures no one had ever extracted from a 302. It wasn't supposed to be possible. Chevy engineers had sworn it wasn't possible. Smokey took a final drag from his cigarette, glanced at the terrified Ford group, and grinned. "Gentlemen," he said, tapping the readout, "that's how you beat a damn Camaro." When word leaked, as secrets like this always do, Detroit trembled. Chevy's engineering department demanded emergency meetings.